Today we're going to make a planter that is also a side table. I was in Home Depot and I saw these really nice Fiddle Leaf Fig plants. I love the aesthetic of these plants but wasn't wild about the pot, but I figured I could change that later. Because for now all I was focused on was how to build a table that could go around the pot. This project involves cutting a lot of circles out of plywood. To do this, I first marked the circles with a pencil and a homemade compass that I made by drilling some holes in a wooden ruler. I then drilled a hole in the plywood and cut the circles out with my jigsaw. I'm going to make the structure for the table out of steel, and I'm going to use these plywood circles as the forms that I'm going to bend steel around. Now I know everyone doesn't have access to a welder, so don't worry, I'll show an option how to make one of these structures without one. For the smaller circle, I drove in screws to hold the steel in place as I bent it. I used a Sharpie to mark the location where the steel overlapped so that when I unscrewed it, I would have a reference point so I'd know exactly where to cut. I cut the steel with an angle grinder, and while I had the angle grinder in my hands, I used it to clean off some of the mill scale. I secured the plywood circle, drilled some holes in it, and then used zip ties to hold the circle closed so that I could weld it. I did a quick tack weld with my MIG welder, removed the steel hoop, and then welded all the way around. I then did the same thing with the larger circle, but this time I used clamps instead of zip ties. For the vertical supports, I'm going to use 1/8 of an inch thick, 1 inch wide steel bars. I started by just lightly tacking these onto the larger steel circle. I just want them to be held in place, but I still want to be able to bend and shape it a little bit before I do the final welds. I used some scrap 2x4s to build a stand that would hold the plywood circle at the right height and then push the steel around it so that it would be held in place while I welded it to the steel bars. Steel may seem like an odd choice of materials for a structure this small, but once you have the welding equipment, steel is relatively cheap and welding small pieces together doesn't take very long. It also lets me build lightweight, thin structures that are quite strong. I used a wire brush on my angle grinder to clean up all the welds. I want to paint this structure a different color than the planter itself, but first I need to prime it, and I like to use rusty metal primer from Rustoleum. Once the primer was fully dry, I then painted over it with Rustoleum protective enamel in a gloss bright yellow. This primer and protective enamel combination is my go-to finish for steel. For painting plastics like this flower pot, I like to use the Rustoleum 2X. It adheres to plastic really well, and I went with a white matte finish to contrast against the glossy yellow. For the tabletop, I cut a larger circle out of maple veneer plywood. I used a hole saw to cut a circle out of the center of it to create room for the trunk of the fig tree. I used my circular saw to cut 2 straight lines that would create access to this center hole. I used my orbital sander to sand around the edges to smooth them out. For dust protection, I'm wearing my RZmask. It is by far the most comfortable dust mask I've ever worn. I used some 220 grit paper to hand sand down the top just enough to remove the pencil marks. I sealed the wood tabletop with Varathane, water-based polyurethane, and crystal clear matte. I really like this finish for light colored woods when you don't want them to get too dark or honey colored. We place a large saucer in the bottom of the steel cage and then place the planter on top of it. This way the excess water from the plant has a place to drain. The tabletop fits on nicely and I didn't bother to secure it. Now if I wanted to, I could use some hot glue or some staples to attach it to the steel hoop. I like being able to easily remove it so that I can access the plant if I need to. Now if you don't have access to a welder, you can cut plywood rings to use instead of the metal ones that I made. Steel vertical supports are still a good idea, but this time in addition to cutting them, I suggest grinding some notches just about halfway through, so you can put a slight bend in them that allow them to sit flush against the edges of the plywood. I drilled holes in the ends for screws to go through. and when I cut the notches on the other side, I flipped them over so that the bent tabs would stay vertical. If you're going to go this route, I suggest pre-painting all the pieces and assembling it around the planter itself. I use 3/4 inch long pan head screws to attach the steel to the plywood. And there you have it, an easy no welding version. This project checks so many different boxes. It's quick, it's easy, and I love how it adds both vegetation and a pop of color to my living room. This planter side table and the sofa that you see here are both going inside the container house. If you want to see that series, be sure to click on the link in the description box below. I created a whole separate YouTube channel just for that project. Check out some of our other videos and don't forget to subscribe to this channel if you haven't already. Thanks. Bye.